The chisel marks are 3,000 years old, but they look fresh. Whoever held the tool didn't care about the wall. They cared about the face. You can trace where the nose was, where the jaw extended in that strange, elongated style that belonged to only one king. The mouth, gone. The eyes, gone. The cartouche, the royal name sealed inside its oval ring, has been scooped from the limestone like infected flesh from a wound. This was not vandalism. This was a campaign. Thousands of workers dispatched across hundreds of miles, entering every temple, every tomb, every monument they could reach with one instruction: remove him, his name, his image, his god, everything. And when they finished, they sealed his city under sand and never spoke his name again. They called him the criminal. They called him the enemy. For over 3,000 years, it worked. He disappeared so completely that modern scholars had to dig him out of rubble to prove he had ever existed. His name was Akhenaten, and this is the story of how one man forced an entire civilization to look at the sun, and how that civilization, the moment he was gone, chose to close its eyes and bury every trace that he had lived. Subscribe if you want history that doesn't treat you like a tourist. Let me know where you're watching from. I read every one. 1400 years before Rome. 1400 years before Athens had a name anyone remembered. Egypt was already old by the time the boy who would become Akhenaten drew his first breath, somewhere around 1380 BCE, though the exact year is another thing the record refuses to confirm. The civilization he was born into had been building temples, burying kings, and recording its own greatness for nearly 2,000 years. The pyramids at Giza were already ancient to him. Already tourist attractions, if we're honest. Graffiti from his era has been found on their walls, left by scribes who visited them the way we visit medieval cathedrals, with awe and with the faint discomfort of standing inside something built by people who are utterly gone. His father was Amenhotep III, and to understand what happened to the son, you have to understand what the father built, not just in stone, but in expectation. Amenhotep III ruled Egypt for nearly 38 years, and during that time, he turned an already powerful kingdom into something closer to a force of nature. The gold mines of Nubia poured wealth northward. The trade routes hummed. Foreign kings, the rulers of Babylon, Mitanni, Assyria, the Hittites, wrote to him on clay tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, addressing him with the kind of deference you reserve for someone who could destroy you but has chosen for now not to. These are the Amarna letters. Over 300 of them survive, cracked and incomplete, pulled from the ruins of a city that didn't exist yet during most of Amenhotep III's reign. They are the single most detailed diplomatic archive from the ancient Near East, and they read like a ledger of dependency. Everyone wanted Egyptian gold. Everyone wanted Egyptian protection. Everyone wanted to stay on the right side of a king whose military could reach them before their messengers could reach him. The wealth was staggering. Not in the abstract way that word gets used about ancient empires, but in physical, documented, countable terms. Amenhotep III built a palace complex at Malkata, on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, that covered more than 30 hectares, an estate so vast it contained its own harbour, dug specifically so the royal barge could dock at the king's private entrance. He erected hundreds of statues of himself, many of them colossal. The two that still sit on the Theban plain, cracked and weather-beaten, known today as the Colossi of Memnon, once guarded the entrance to a mortuary temple that was the largest religious structure in Egypt. Larger than Karnak, it's gone now, dismantled, flooded, cannibalized for stone by later pharaohs. But in its day, it told a story, and the story was simple. This king answers to no one, and behind the king stood the priesthood of Amun. This matters more than most accounts acknowledge. The temple of Amun at Karnak was not merely a place of worship, it was the economic engine of Upper Egypt. It controlled enormous tracts of agricultural land. It employed thousands of people: priests, scribes, bakers, brewers, weavers, farmers, herdsmen, boatmen, and administrators, whose sole job was tracking the grain, the linen, the cattle, the beer, and the bread that flowed through the temple's storerooms every single day. The high priest of Amun was, in practical terms, the second most powerful person in the country. And the theology that sustained all of this, the belief system that justified the temple's wealth, the priesthood's authority, and the pharaoh's divine right to rule, rested on a single unquestioned idea. Amun was king of the gods, and the pharaoh was his son on earth. Amenhotep III worked within that system. He expanded it, he enriched it. He celebrated its festivals with a generosity that the temple records describe in terms that border on disbelief. Thousands of loaves of bread, hundreds of jars of beer, entire herds of cattle slaughtered in a single ceremony. The system loved him for it. The system needed him for it. And the system expected his successor to do exactly the same thing. His successor was supposed to be his eldest son, Prince Thutmose, named Crown Prince, trained in the rituals of kingship, depicted in official inscriptions with the titles that marked him as heir. He held the role of High Priest of Ptah at Memphis, a position of real religious authority, a signal that the transition had been planned, rehearsed, and approved by every institution that mattered. And then he vanished from the record. No death scene, no funeral inscription that we've found, no explanation. 1 year his name appears on a sarcophagus prepared for his pet cat, a small human detail that survives when everything else about him has been swallowed. At the next year, the record moves on without him. The younger son stepped forward, or more accurately, was pushed. Amenhotep IV, that was his birth name, his throne name, the name the system gave him, was not prepared for this. The evidence is indirect but consistent. He does not appear in any crown prince inscriptions. He held no known administrative or priestly title before his accession. He was, as far as the surviving record can tell us, the son who was not needed, the backup plan that no one expected to activate. Some scholars have speculated about a physical condition. The unusual body proportions in his later art have fueled decades of medical diagnosis at a distance, most of it irresponsible. What we can say with more confidence is that he spent his early years outside the machinery of succession, watching the system from a position that was close enough to see everything and far enough to owe it nothing. I've sat with this thought for a long time, what it does to a person growing up adjacent to absolute power but never intended to hold it. Not rejected exactly, just unnecessary. And then, without warning, necessary. Handed the most complex political inheritance in the ancient world and expected to perform a role that someone else had been trained for since childhood. The system didn't ask if he was ready. The system didn't care. In the theology that governed Egyptian kingship, the moment the crown settled on his head, he became, as the priests and the rituals and the entire weight of 2,000 years of tradition defined it, the living embodiment of Horus, the divine intermediary between the human world and the cosmic order they called Ma'at. By every rule they lived under, he was no longer entirely a man. But the man underneath the crown had spent years watching. And what he'd watched, among other things, was the priesthood of Amun growing so powerful that the god's servants were beginning to rival the god's son. The coronation followed the ancient forms. The rituals were performed. The offerings were made. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, were symbolically unified under his rule, as they had been unified under every pharaoh for centuries, in a ceremony that was as much theatre as theology. And for a brief period, perhaps a year, perhaps two, Amenhotep IV governed as his father had governed. He appeared at Karnak. He honored Amun. He maintained the system. Then he did something no one expected. He commissioned a temple. At Karnak itself, inside the sacred precinct of Amun, within walking distance of the greatest temple complex in Egypt. But this temple was not for Amun. It was for the Aten, the sun disk. A deity that had existed in Egyptian religious thought for generations but had never held primary status, never commanded its own major cult center, never threatened Amun's supremacy. Until now. The construction method tells us something the inscriptions don't. He used talatat blocks, small, standardized sandstone bricks, roughly the length of a man's forearm, designed to be carried by a single worker and laid fast. Traditional temple construction used massive blocks, moved by teams, carved in place over years. The talatat system was different. It was fast. Thousands of blocks, thousands of workers, a structure rising inside Amun's own precinct at a pace that must have alarmed every priest who watched it climb. And the images on those blocks, when archaeologists recovered tens of thousands of them centuries later from the fill of pylons where they'd been buried as rubble, showed a king who had already begun to change. The art was different. The body was different. The elongated face, the full lips, the narrow eyes, the soft belly and wide hips that would become the defining visual signature of his reign. All of it was already present, carved into the walls of a temple that sat in the shadow of Amun's domain, like a declaration of war written in stone. The priests would have seen this. The court would have seen this. Amenhotep III, if he was still alive during the early co-regency, and scholars disagree bitterly about this, the co-regency question has generated more academic heat than almost any other problem in 18th dynasty chronology, would have seen this. Nobody stopped him. That silence is worth sitting with. A new pharaoh, untested, unplanned, building a temple to a minor deity inside the most politically sensitive religious site in the country, using construction methods designed for speed rather than permanence. And the system that could have resisted him did not resist. Whether that was because the pharaoh's authority was too absolute to challenge, or because the people around him hadn't yet understood what he intended, or because they assumed this was a phase that would pass. We don't know. The record offers no voices of dissent from these early years, no letters of protest, no evidence of institutional resistance, just the blocks going up, row after row, fast, as if the man giving the orders already knew he was running out of time, though what kind of time, and why he felt the urgency, that I still cannot tell you. the sun rose over Karnak the way it always had. The priests of Amun performed their morning rituals in the dark inner sanctum the way they always had. And somewhere nearby, in a courtyard open to the sky, a different kind of worship was taking shape. One that had no use for darkness, no patience for tradition, and no interest in sharing the heavens. The system held its breath. It wouldn't hold it long. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV erased himself, not from the monuments, not from the temples, from his own name. He shed the identity his father had given him, Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, and replaced it with something the Egyptian court had never heard a king call himself before, Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. In a single administrative act, he cut the most powerful god in Egypt out of his own royal identity and replaced him with a deity that 5 years earlier had barely warranted its own shrine. Names were not decorative in ancient Egypt. They carried weight that is difficult to translate into modern terms. In the framework of Egyptian belief, a name was not a label. It was a component of the self, as real as bone, as necessary as breath. To speak a person's name was, in their understanding, to sustain them. To destroy a name was to unmake the person it belonged to, not just in memory, but in whatever existence they believed followed death. When Akhenaten abandoned the name Amenhotep, the people around him would not have heard a rebranding exercise. They would have heard a man killing a part of himself, publicly, deliberately, and replacing it with something that made the rest of the pantheon irrelevant. Then he announced he was leaving. The boundaries staley survive. 14 of them, carved into the limestone cliffs on both sides of the Nile, roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis, marking the edges of a city that did not yet exist. They are among the most unusual royal inscriptions in Egyptian history, not because of their scale, which is considerable, but because of their tone. Royal inscriptions in Egypt tend toward formula. The king is mighty, the gods approve, the enemies are crushed, the land prospers. These stelae read differently. The language is personal in a way that feels almost raw. Akhenaten describes the Aten choosing this specific place. He describes the court's resistance, an extraordinary admission for a pharaoh to carve into permanent stone. He swears an oath. He will build his city here. He will never extend it beyond these boundaries, and he will never leave. The oath is repeated, reinforced, almost defensive. I've read these inscriptions in translation many times, and the voice I hear in them is not a conqueror's voice. It's the voice of someone who has already been told no by advisors, by priests, by the weight of institutional inertia, and who has decided that argument is pointless. He would not persuade, he would leave, and he would take the government with him. The city rose from nothing. Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, modern Amarna, a stretch of desert on the east bank, curved as to a natural amphitheater by the cliffs, untouched by previous settlement, unclaimed by any existing temple or priesthood. Virgin ground. That mattered theologically. No other god had ever been worshipped here, which meant the Aten's presence would be uncontaminated, undiluted, pure. The construction speed defies casual explanation. Within 3 to 4 years, an entire functioning capital appeared where there had been empty sand. Palaces, temples, administrative complexes, military barracks, workers' housing, storage facilities, a diplomatic quarter, a royal road wide enough for chariot processions, and at the center of everything, the great temple of the Aten. Open-roofed, no enclosed sanctuary, no dark inner chamber where a statue sat in sacred isolation, visited by priests in rituals the public never saw. The temple was a vast open courtyard. Some reconstructions estimate it stretched over half a mile in length, filled with hundreds of stone offering tables arranged in rows, exposed to the sky. The god was the sun. The temple let the sun in. This was an inversion so complete that it requires a moment to absorb. For more than 1,000 years, Egyptian temples had functioned as machines of controlled access. Layer after layer of walls, corridors, and doorways, each one narrowing the space, reducing the light, limiting who could enter. The innermost sanctum was pitch dark. The god's image, a statue, often gold, always hidden, sat in total blackness, attended by the high priest alone. The architecture itself enforced a theology of hierarchy. The closer you stood to the god, the more powerful you were. The further away, the less you mattered. Every Egyptian understood this structure. It was the physical expression of how their world was organized. Divine power at the center, everyone else arranged in concentric rings of diminishing access. Akhenaten demolished that logic, not just metaphorically, physically. His temple had no inner sanctum because his god needed no statue. His god was overhead, visible to everyone, every day, without priestly mediation. The implications of this were enormous, and the priesthood of Amun, whose authority, whose income, whose entire reason for existence depended on being the gatekeepers between the god and the people, would have understood those implications instantly. He didn't stop at architecture. The orders went out across Egypt. Close the temples of Amun. Redirect their revenues, their grain, their cattle, their land, their labor, to the Aten and to the new capital. Reassign or dismiss the priests. And then the final act, the one that transformed policy into something that felt, to the millions who lived under it, like an assault. Send teams of workers into every temple, every tomb, every public monument in the country, and chisel out the name of Amun wherever it appeared. Every cartouche, every inscription, every prayer carved into every lintel and door frame and offering table from the Delta to Nubia. The name of the god who, by the reckoning of nearly every Egyptian alive, held the cosmos in order, scraped from the stone as if it were a disease. The scale of this campaign is difficult to overstate. Egypt was enormous. Its monuments numbered in the tens of thousands. The teams dispatched to carry out the erasure must have worked for years, moving from site to site, entering sacred spaces that had been maintained for centuries, and methodically destroying the name that gave those spaces their meaning. They went after private tombs, the burial places of ordinary officials who had invoked Amun in their funerary prayers, not because those officials mattered politically, but because the name itself had to be eradicated wherever it survived. The thoroughness was ideological, total, uncompromising, and it was not limited to Amun. There is evidence, debated but persistent, that the plural word gods was also targeted in some inscriptions. The entire concept of divine plurality may have been offensive to whatever vision was driving Akhenaten forward. One god, one king, one city, one truth. Think about what that felt like on the ground. Not in the palace, not in the open-roofed temple where the king performed his rituals in the sunlight. On the ground. in the villages along the Nile, where farmers and fishermen and potters had prayed to Amun, to Osiris, to Hathor, to Isis, to the local gods of their specific towns. Prayed to them for good harvests, for safe childbirth, for protection from disease, for the souls of their dead, and were now told by royal decree that all of it was wrong. That the gods they had trusted were not merely secondary to the Aten, but non-existent in any way that mattered. That the rituals they had performed for their parents and grandparents and children who died young were addressed to nothing. No consultation, no debate, no transition period. A single man in a city most of them would never see declared the spiritual foundations of their entire existence invalid. The conventional framing of this, the one most documentaries use, is that Akhenaten was a visionary, a proto-monotheist, a man ahead of his time. And there may be an element of truth in that. The Aten theology, as far as we can reconstruct it from the great hymn to the Aten, found inscribed in the tomb of the courtier Ai at Amarna, is genuinely striking. The hymn describes a single creative force responsible for all life, every nation, every language, every creature, every season, sustained by light, dependent on the sun's daily return. The language has a breadth and a universalism that later scholars have compared, not unreasonably, to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. Whatever was happening inside Akhenaten's mind, it produced something that reads, even now, as a serious attempt to describe the unity of all living things under a single source. But sincerity does not excuse the mechanism. A man can believe something profoundly and still cause immense harm in the way he imposes that belief on others. The two are not mutually exclusive. They almost never are. What we hear from ordinary Egyptians during these years is nothing. The administrative record thins. The private letters that survive deal with grain shipments and legal disputes, not theology. The voices of the people whose temples went dark and whose gods were silenced are absent from the archive. Whether that absence reflects genuine compliance, terrorized silence, or simply the kind of records that don't survive 3 millennia of decay, I cannot tell you. The evidence doesn't reach that far. But the speed of the reversal after Akhenaten's death, the frantic, almost panicked restoration of everything he had destroyed, tells us something about what those silent years actually contained. Systems that are genuinely accepted do not get dismantled overnight. Systems that are held in place by a single will and nothing else collapse the moment that will is removed. Amarna at its peak was a city of perhaps 30,000 people, maybe more. A functioning capital with all the complexity that implies bakeries and breweries, workshops producing glass and faience, scribal schools, a diplomatic corps handling correspondence in multiple languages, a royal guard, a harem, a loaded word. The Egyptian institution was administrative as much as domestic, a residence for royal women and their households that functioned as a political entity. And at the heart of it all, the royal road, where every day, every single day, Akhenaten and Nefertiti rode in their chariot from the northern palace to the central city, visible to the population, bathed in sunlight, performing the theology with their own bodies. Because in Akhenaten's system, as his inscriptions describe it, the Aten did not communicate with humanity through priests or rituals or sacred statues. The Aten communicated through the royal family. The king and queen were the sole intermediaries, the only channel through which the gods' grace, as they understood it, reached the world. Remove the royal family from the equation, and the theology had no mechanism, no delivery system. The god shone, but only the king could interpret what the light meant. This is where the vision becomes a trap. A theology that depends entirely on one family is a theology that cannot survive that family. And Akhenaten, whether he understood this or not, had built a religion with a single point of failure. The great temple stretched toward the horizon, its offering tables gleaming in rows, the sun pouring into every corner without obstruction, without shadow, without the mercy of a single dark room where doubt could hide. The floors were painted. That detail tends to get lost in the larger narrative, but it shouldn't. The floors of the palaces at Amarna were covered in painted scenes, marshlands, lotus pools, fish darting through blue-green water, birds rising from papyrus thickets, so that the royal family walked, literally, across a living world rendered in pigment beneath their feet. The ceilings were painted too, grapevines, flying ducks, the kind of natural abundance that Egyptian artists had always depicted in tombs, but rarely in the spaces where the living actually moved. Amarna's architecture was designed not for eternity, but for experience, for sensation, for now. This was a different kind of royal statement, and it extended beyond decoration into the fundamental grammar of how art represented the human body and the human relationship. The art changed. Everyone who studies this period says so, and they're right. But the nature of the change is more complicated than most treatments allow. For centuries, Egyptian royal art had followed a set of visual conventions so rigid they functioned almost as a language. The pharaoh depicted with broad shoulders, a narrow waist, an idealized musculature that was the same whether the king was 20 or 70, healthy or dying. The body was not a portrait, it was a symbol, a container for divine authority, rendered in the form the system required. Akhenaten shattered that container. His artists, and we know some of their names, including the chief sculptor Thutmose, whose workshop at Amarna yielded the famous bust of Nefertiti now in Berlin, depicted the king with an elongated skull, a narrow jaw that dropped to an almost pointed chin, heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, a long neck, rounded hips, a soft protruding belly, and thin arms that looked incapable of drawing a bow. No pharaoh had ever been shown this way. The image was so far from the traditional ideal that early Egyptologists assumed Akhenaten must have suffered from a genetic disorder. Marfan syndrome, Froelich's syndrome, various endocrine conditions have all been proposed and none confirmed. The mummy tentatively identified as his, KRV 55, and that identification remains a battlefield among specialists, does not show the extreme features of the art. People call this style naturalistic. That word keeps circulating and it misses the point. Nothing about these depictions is naturalistic. No human being has ever looked like the colossal statues from the Aten temple at Karnak. Those extraordinary figures, now in the Cairo Museum, with their androgynous features and their alien calm. This was not realism replacing idealism. This was one kind of stylization replacing another. The old style said, "The king is powerful, eternal, physically perfect." The new style said something else entirely, something scholars are still arguing about. The king is transformed. The king's body belongs to the light. The king is not like you. Or, and this reading has its defenders, the king is more like you than any pharaoh has ever admitted. Soft, strange, mortal looking, a body that ages and swells and bends under its own weight. Take your pick. The art sustains both readings, which may be exactly what it was designed to do. But the domestic scenes, these are harder to argue with and harder to dismiss. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are shown kissing, holding their daughters on their laps, riding together in an open chariot, eating together, the children reaching for fruit, the parents leaning toward each other with a physical ease that has no precedent in 3,000 years of Egyptian royal art. One relief, fragmentary, damaged but legible, shows Nefertiti seated on Akhenaten's lap. Another shows the couple mourning over the body of a dead child, their arms reaching toward the small figure on a bier, their grief rendered without restraint, without the formal composure that Egyptian art normally imposed on royal emotion. These images were public, carved into temple walls, painted in the tombs of courtiers, distributed across the city in a way that ensured everyone in Amarna saw the royal family not as distant symbols, but as a unit, intimate, tactile, emotionally present. And this was not accidental. In Akhenaten's theological system, as his inscriptions defined it, the royal family was the mechanism through which the Aten's creative force reached the world. The king and queen, together with their children, constituted the living channel of divine power. Their closeness was not merely personal, it was, by the logic of the new religion, cosmic. Nefertiti's position within this system was extraordinary by any standard. She was not standing behind the king, she was beside him and in some images ahead of him. In reliefs from Amarna and from the earlier Talatat blocks at Karnak, Nefertiti appears in poses that had been reserved exclusively for the pharaoh for over 1,000 years, smiting foreign enemies with a raised mace, offering directly to the Aten without the king present, wearing crowns that no queen had ever worn. Her name was written in a cartouche, a privilege normally restricted to the king. Some scholars have argued, and the evidence, while circumstantial, is persistent, that she functioned as co-regent during the later years of Akhenaten's reign, wielding executive authority that went beyond any ceremonial role. Her prominence was structural, not decorative. The theology required her. The Aten's rays, in every artistic depiction, terminate in small hands, some offering the ankh, the symbol of life, and those rays extend to both the king and the queen, equally, simultaneously. Remove Nefertiti from the image, and the theology collapses into something lopsided, incomplete. She wasn't there because Akhenaten loved her, though the art suggests he did. She was there because the system he built could not function without her. And then consider the children. 6 daughters, depicted constantly in temple reliefs, on household shrines, in the intimate family scenes that defined Amarna's visual culture. Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferuaten. Tasherit, Neferneferur, Setepenre. Their names survive even when their lives do not. They were not ornamental. In a theology that placed the royal family at the center of cosmic function, every member mattered. Every daughter was a node in the network through which, as the Aten religion taught, divine grace flowed into the world. No sons, at least none that the record at Amarna acknowledges openly. Tutankhamun, the boy who would eventually inherit the wreckage, was probably Akhenaten's child, either by a secondary wife named Kia or, according to some DNA analyses, always contested. The genetics of the late 18th dynasty are a scholarly minefield. by a close family member whose identity remains unresolved. But at Amarna, during the years of the city's flourishing, the royal image was female. Father, mother, daughters, the family as theological instrument. The court adapted, or at least it performed adaptation. The tombs of Amarna's officials, carved into the eastern cliffs overlooking the city, tell us what loyalty looked like under the new regime. Unlike traditional Egyptian tombs, which focused on the deceased's journey through the afterworld they believed in and the gods they hoped would protect them, the Amarna tombs focus almost entirely on the king. Scene after scene shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti worshipping the Aten, distributing gold rewards to loyal officials, riding in procession along the royal road. The tomb owners appear, but as witnesses, as recipients of royal favor, as supporting characters in someone else's story. The afterlife imagery that had dominated Egyptian funerary art for centuries, the judgment before Osiris, the fields of paradise, the protective spells, is gone, replaced by the royal family and the sun. Whether the officials who commissioned these tombs genuinely believed in the Aten or were performing belief because their careers demanded it, I cannot tell you with any certainty. I suspect the answer varied from person to person, the way it always does when a new ideology is enforced from above. Some true believers, some opportunists, some who kept their real thoughts behind their teeth and did what survival required. The tomb of the official Huya contains scenes of such elaborate praise for the king that they read, to my ear at least, like a man trying very hard to be noticed. But that's interpretation, not evidence, and I should be honest about the difference. Behind closed doors, a different story survived in the ground. The workmen's village at Amarna, a walled settlement on the eastern edge of the city, excavated extensively by Barry Kemp and the Amarna Project, housed the laborers who built and maintained the royal tombs. Their homes were small, standardized, arranged in tight rows within an enclosure wall. And inside those homes, archaeologists found something the official theology had tried to make impossible: private devotion to the old gods. Small figurines of Bes, the dwarf god of household protection. Amulets of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Painted images of deities that Akhenaten's program had officially erased from the religious landscape of Egypt. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of necessity. When your child is sick, when your wife is in labor, when the night feels too long and the world too fragile, you do not pray to a theology. You pray to whatever has always answered before, or whatever in the tradition you inherited from your mother and her mother before her was supposed to answer. The Aten was the king's god. In the rooms where ordinary life happened, the pain, the fear, the helpless waiting, the old gods persisted, quietly, below the surface, like water under sand. Amarna lasted roughly 15 years as a functioning capital. During that time, it was, by every physical measure, a real city. Complex, inhabited, administratively active, diplomatically connected, artistically productive. The glass workshops produced pieces of extraordinary quality. The diplomatic archive handled correspondence from across the Near East. The Great Temple received offerings daily. The royal road carried the chariot procession every morning. The painted floors shimmered underfoot, and then the cracks opened. Not in the walls, in the family. Around year 12, the dates here are approximate, reconstructed from fragmentary evidence and cross-referenced with the Amarna letters chronology. something shifted. The second daughter, Akhenaten, died. She was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. Her death is recorded in the royal tomb at Amarna, in a scene that remains one of the most emotionally unguarded images in all of Egyptian art. The king and queen standing before the child's body, Akhenaten's arm extended toward her, Nefertiti's posture bent with what can only be described as physical grief, a nurse holding a newborn in the background. Did Akhenaten die in childbirth at that age? The possibility is there, and it's a grim one. The scene has no divine comfort, no Osiris waiting in the west, no protective spell, just parents and a dead child at the silence of a theology that had no room for death. Within 2 years, at least 2 more princesses vanish from the record. Their names stop appearing. No funerary scenes for them survive, or none that have been found. The most widely accepted explanation is epidemic disease, the same plague that Hittite records describe sweeping through the Near East during this period, devastating populations from Anatolia to the Levantine coast. If it reached Amarna, the city's density would have made it lethal, and Nefertiti. Somewhere around year 14, she disappears. Her name is no longer inscribed. Her image is no longer carved. The most prominent woman in the ancient world, the co-architect of a religious revolution, the queen whose face, recovered from Thutmose's workshop 3,000 years later, would become the most recognized image from all of Egyptian civilization, simply ceases to exist in the record. Dead? Disgraced? Ruling under another name? The theories are numerous. The evidence is thin. I have spent more time than I should admit reading the arguments for each possibility, and none of them closes cleanly. What I keep returning to is the theology, a religion that required an intact royal family to function. A family that was visibly, publicly, irreversibly breaking apart, and a city in the desert, built for one man's vision of perfect clarity, filling with grief that the vision had no language to address. Rib-Hada wrote 68 letters, 68 that survived, buried in the floor of a foreign ministry in a city that would itself be buried within a generation. He was the ruler of Byblos, a port city on the Lebanese coast, one of Egypt's oldest and most loyal vassal states, a relationship that stretched back centuries. And he was dying. Not personally, not yet, though that would come. His city was dying. His alliances were collapsing. His enemies were closing in. And the Pharaoh to whom he owed allegiance, to whom he had pledged loyalty, to whom he addressed letter after letter in the formal Akkadian of international diplomacy, that Pharaoh was not answering. The Amarna letters are a diplomatic archive, but reading Rib-Hada's correspondence in sequence produces something closer to a psychological document. The early letters are formal, respectful, measured, a vassal requesting assistance through the proper channels, confident that the system will respond. The middle letters grow sharper. He names specific threats. He reports troop movements. He describes cities falling to Aziru of Amuru, a local strongman who was playing Egypt against the Hittites with a skill that the Egyptian administration either failed to notice or chose to ignore. The later letters abandon protocol entirely. Rib-Hada accuses the Pharaoh's officials of corruption. He accuses them of intercepting his messages. He begs, he threatens. He writes as a man who has realized that the empire he served no longer recognizes his existence. His final letters were written from exile. Byblos had fallen. he had fled to Beirut. He asked one last time for Egyptian intervention. The archive contains no reply, and Rib Hada was not alone. Across the Levant, from the coast of modern Lebanon through Syria and into the edges of what is now Israel and Palestine, Egypt's network of vassal states was unraveling. The system Amenhotep III had maintained through gold, diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the ever-present threat of military force required active management. It required attention. It required a pharaoh who understood that empire is not a monument you build once and walk away from. Empire is a conversation that never stops, conducted through gifts and threats and carefully timed displays of power. And the moment the conversation goes silent, the other participants draw their own conclusions. Akhenaten's attention was elsewhere. The evidence for this is not ambiguous. The diplomatic archive at Amarna, the very fact that it was found there, abandoned in the ruins, tells us that the letters were received, logged, and filed. They were not lost in transit. They arrived. Someone read them, and in most cases, nothing happened. The military expeditions that Amenhotep III would have dispatched, punitive campaigns to remind vassal states who held the leash, did not materialize under his son. The gold shipments that had kept foreign kings compliant slowed or stopped. The Egyptian commissioners stationed across the Levant sent increasingly alarmed reports, and the reports accumulated in the archive like sediment. Meanwhile, the Hittite Empire, under Suppiluliuma I, one of the most capable military strategists of the late Bronze Age, was expanding southward into territory that Egypt had considered its own for generations. The kingdom of Mitanni, which had been Egypt's principal ally in northern Mesopotamia, was destroyed. The buffer states that had kept the Hittites at a comfortable distance from Egypt's sphere of influence were absorbed one by one into a Hittite orbit. The geopolitical map of the Near East was being redrawn while Akhenaten oversaw the placement of offering tables in the Great Temple. I want to be careful here, because the narrative of imperial neglect can be oversimplified. Some scholars have argued that Akhenaten's foreign policy was not as passive as the Amarna letters suggest, that the archive is incomplete, that military actions may have occurred without being recorded in diplomatic correspondence, that the loss of vassal states may have been a strategic calculation rather than pure negligence. These are legitimate arguments. But the weight of evidence, the desperation of the letters, the scale of territorial loss, the speed of the Hittite advance, and the absence of any Egyptian military response that left a trace in the archaeological or textual record points in one direction. The empire contracted, and the king did not intervene. But the damage extended beyond borders. Inside Egypt, the disruption was structural, and it reached people who had never heard of Byblos and would never meet a Hittite soldier. The temples of Amun were not churches. That analogy, tempting as it is, obscures more than it reveals. The temple of Amun at Karnak and its network of subsidiary temples, estates, and administrative centers across Upper Egypt functioned as the spine of the regional economy. It controlled vast agricultural holdings, fields, orcharding houses, granaries, cattle herds. It employed a workforce that numbered in the thousands, not just priests, but bakers who produced the daily bread offerings, brewers who made the beer, weavers who produced the linen for priestly garments, farmers who worked the temple lands, scribes who tracked every grain of wheat and every jar of oil, boatmen who transported goods along the Nile, and administrators who coordinated the entire operation with a bureaucratic precision that would impress a modern logistics company. When Akhenaten redirected the temple revenues to the Aten, closing Amun's sanctuaries, reassigning or dismissing the priesthood, and diverting the economic output of the temple estates to his new capital, the effects cascaded downward through every layer of the system. The baker who baked for the temple lost his purpose. The farmer who worked temple land lost his assignment. The scribe who tracked temple grain lost his ledger. These were not abstract losses. They were disruptions to the daily survival of thousands of families whose livelihoods depended on an institution the king had just declared illegitimate. We don't have household-level records of this disruption. That kind of evidence, personal letters, private complaints, family accounts, almost never survives from ancient Egypt, and the Amarna period is no exception. What we have instead is the restoration stela, erected at Karnak in Tutankhamun's name after Akhenaten's death. It describes the state of Egypt's temples in language that, even allowing for political exaggeration, paints a picture of systemic collapse. The sanctuaries had fallen into ruin, it says. The gods had turned their faces from the land. Prayers went unanswered. The army met failure abroad. The land was sick, and the cause, unnamed but unmistakable, was the abandonment of the gods who had sustained it. This was propaganda. Of course it was. The men who wrote it were the same men who had served Akhenaten's government and were now dismantling it. They had every reason to paint the previous regime in the darkest possible terms. But propaganda works best when it contains a core that the audience recognizes as true. The restoration stela was not written for foreign consumption. It was written for Egyptians, for priests, officials, and ordinary people who had lived through Akhenaten's reign and knew from personal experience what it had cost them. If the description of collapsing temples and unanswered prayers had no connection to lived reality, it would have convinced no one. And then there are the bones. The Amarna project's excavations of the city's cemeteries, particularly the South Tombs Cemetery, where ordinary residents were buried, have produced evidence that the people who built and maintained Akhenaten's utopia paid for it with their bodies. Skeletal analysis, published over the past 2 decades by a team led by Jerry Rose and later by Gretchen Dabbs, reveals a population under severe physical stress, high rates of spinal injuries consistent with heavy labor, nutritional deficiencies visible in the bones, anemia, scurvy, signs of chronic malnutrition, growth stunting in juveniles, a mortality profile that skews disturbingly young. A significant percentage of the burials are adolescents and young adults, many of them showing healed and unhealed fractures. These were the workers who quarried the stone, hauled the talatat blocks, laid the foundations, plastered the walls, and painted the floors of the city that was supposed to embody a new vision of divine truth. They were housed in the workman's village, a controlled settlement walled with limited access points. And the wall, I should note, faced inward as much as outward, a detail that is either meaningless or very meaningful, depending on what you think the wall was for. Their diet, based on archaeobotanical and faunal evidence, was heavy on bread and beer and light on the protein and variety that would have sustained them through the labor the city demanded. The painted floors of the palace showed marshlands teeming with birds and fish. The bones of the workers showed something else. I keep returning to that contrast. Not because it's surprising, Every ancient civilization ran on a gap between what the powerful depicted and what the laborers endured. Egypt was no different from Mesopotamia or Rome or any other system that built its grandeur on the backs of people whose names were never recorded. But Amarna is a special case because Amarna was built to represent truth. That was its explicit purpose. The Aten was a god of visibility. No hidden statues, no dark sanctuaries, no layers of priestly mystification standing between reality and its source. Everything was supposed to be in the light. And yet, the people who built the city of light lived in conditions the light was never turned on. If you've ever worked for someone who talked constantly about transparency while keeping you in the dark, about the things that actually affected your life, the pay, the hours, the plan, you have a frame of reference for what Amarna's laborers experienced, scaled up to the level of a civilization. The religious suppression continued throughout these years, and its texture at ground level is worth lingering on. It was not a single decree followed by silence. It was an ongoing campaign, maintained by enforcement, sustained by the constant physical labor of erasure. Teams of workers, some of them perhaps the same workers who built the temples and the palaces, were dispatched to existing monuments across Egypt to locate and destroy every instance of Amun's name. This was not quick work. Amun's name appeared in thousands of inscriptions, on thousands of surfaces, in temples and tombs, separated by hundreds of miles of river. Each erasure required someone to stand before a wall, identify the hieroglyphs, and remove them with tools, carefully enough to destroy the name without destroying the surrounding text. Though in many cases, the surrounding text was damaged anyway. Collateral destruction that no one seems to have worried about. The personal dimension of this gets overlooked. Amun's name didn't just appear in temples, it appeared in people's names. Amenhotep, Amenemhat, Amenerdis. Names that contained the element Amun were scattered across the population, on tomb inscriptions, on legal documents, on the small objects of daily life. When the erasure teams reached a private tomb and found the deceased's name carved above the entrance, a name that contained the offending syllables, they faced a choice that was, in its small way, monstrous. Destroy part of a dead person's identity, or leave the hated god's name intact. In many cases, they chose destruction. The chisel marks in private tombs are shallower, less precise than the ones in state temples, as if the workers knew on some level that what they were doing to these private monuments was different from what they did to public ones. Or maybe they were just tired. Maybe after months of chiseling, the arm gets heavy and the work gets sloppy. I don't know which reading is correct. Both feel true. The living adjusted in ways the record barely captures. Later evidence, from the Ramesside period, a generation or two after Akhenaten, shows a population that clung to the old gods with a fervor that suggests something had been pent up and suddenly released. The personal piety movement that flourished under Ramesses II and his successors, with its emphasis on individual devotion, direct prayer, and personal relationships with deities, has been interpreted by some scholars as a direct response to the trauma of the Amarna period. A people who had their gods taken away learned, when those gods were returned, to hold them closer than before. He died. The record doesn't tell us how. Sometime around 1336 BCE, year 17 of his reign, give or take the margin of error that haunts every absolute date in the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten ceased to exist. No death scene survives, no inscription records the cause, no medical text describes a final illness. The man who had insisted that everything happen in the light disappeared from history in total darkness, and the silence around his death is so complete that it feels, after a while, deliberate. His age at death is uncertain. Estimates range from the mid-30s to the mid-40s, depending on which skeletal remains you accept as his. And that question, the identification of the body found in tomb K-55 in the Valley of the Kings, has produced one of the longest-running forensic arguments in Egyptology. The tomb itself was a mess when it was opened in 1907, waterlogged, partially collapsed, the coffin's gold face ripped away, the mummy inside badly deteriorated. The coffin's inscriptions had been altered, names removed, titles changed, in ways that made identification a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Some scholars are confident the body is Akhenaten's. Others assign it to Smenkhkare, the shadowy figure who may have ruled briefly as co-regent or successor. The DNA analysis published in 2010, the so-called Tutankhamun Family Project, tentatively identified the KV-55 remains as Tutankhamun's father, which should make it Akhenaten if the standard genealogy holds. But the methodology of that study has been challenged on multiple fronts, and confident is not a word I'd use for any conclusion about this body. What we know is this: the king died. And the system he had built, the theology, the city, the diplomatic posture, the economic restructuring, the entire apparatus of a civilization reorganized around one man's vision of one God, began to collapse before his body was cold. The immediate succession is murky. A figure called Smenkhkare appears in the record, briefly like a face glimpsed through fog. He may have been Akhenaten's co-regent during the final years. He may have been a younger brother. He may, and this is a theory with serious adherents, have been Nefertiti herself, ruling under a throne name after her apparent disappearance from the record around year 14. The evidence for each identification is frustratingly thin. What we can say is that whoever Smenkhkare was, their reign lasted no more than a year or two, and they left almost no administrative trace. A ghost on the throne, holding a seat warm for the child who would follow. Tutankhaten, 9 years old, perhaps 10, a boy whose parentage remains debated, probably Akhenaten's son, possibly by the secondary wife Kia, possibly by another close family member whose identity the genetic evidence has not resolved to anyone's full satisfaction. A child placed on the throne of the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world, surrounded by men who had already decided what was going to happen next. The men who mattered were two, I and Horemheb. I was elderly, politically experienced, possibly Nefertiti's father, a man who had served at the highest levels of Akhenaten's court and who understood, with the clarity of a survivor, which way the wind was shifting. Horemheb was a general, a military man who had managed Egypt's diminished foreign affairs during the later Amarna years and who had watched, with what I can only imagine was professional horror, as the empire's vassal network disintegrated. Together, they constituted the real government behind a boy king who could barely lift the crook and flail. The reversal began with a name. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. Living image of the Aten became living image of Amun. The single most important god name in the child's identity was surgically replaced, and the surgery happened fast, within the first year or two of the new reign. A child's identity rewritten to signal to every priest and official and farmer in Egypt that the experiment was over. Then the court moved back to Thebes. The diplomatic machinery re-engaged. There is evidence that Horemheb personally led or oversaw military campaigns to reassert Egyptian authority in the Levant, though the details are sparse. The temples of Amun reopened. The revenues flowed back. The priesthood was restored to its estates, its granaries, its herds, its workforce. The old rituals resumed in the old darkness behind the old doors, with the old incense burning in rooms that had been shuttered for nearly 2 decades. And the restoration stela went up at Karnak. This text, carved in Tutankhamun's name but composed by the minds behind the throne, is one of the most revealing documents from the entire Amarna aftermath. Not for what it says about Akhenaten, it never names him, but for what it says about the damage. The land had been in disorder, it declares. The temples were in ruin, overgrown with weeds. The gods had turned away from Egypt. If a man prayed, no god answered. If the army marched, it met defeat. The language is formulaic in places. Egyptian royal texts always are, but the specificity is unusual. This was not a generic lament. It was an indictment aimed at a dead king's legacy, written in the voice of a child who could not yet read it. The repairs were expensive. The stela describes Tutankhamun commissioning new cult statues for the gods, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, every precious material the treasury could provide. New priesthoods were appointed, new festivals were funded. The entire religious infrastructure of Egypt was rebuilt, and the bill was enormous. Some of the gold that went into the restoration may have been melted down from Amarna's own temples, the Aten's wealth recycled to pay for the gods he had replaced. The irony would have been lost on no one. Tutankhamun died young, around 19 years old. The cause has been debated for decades. Murder, malaria, a broken leg that became infected, a genetic condition inherited from a family whose intermarriage had narrowed the bloodline to a dangerous degree. The CT scans and DNA analyses have offered partial answers and generated new questions. What matters for this story is the timing. The boy king, the instrument of restoration, died before the restoration was complete. He left no heir. The throne passed to Ai, the old courtier, the survivor, who ruled for 4 years and then died himself, leaving the way clear for the man who had been waiting. Horemheb. The general took the throne, and he finished what the reversal had started. Horemheb did something that, even by the standards of Egyptian political manipulation, was breathtaking in its audacity. He backdated his own reign. He assigned himself the regnal years of Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and Ai, absorbing their entire collective existence into his own chronology, as if the previous 30 years of Egyptian history had been his reign all along. In official records from his time onward, the king lists skip from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb. 4 pharaohs, an entire generation of rulers, were removed from the sequence of legitimate kings. Administratively, they ceased to have existed. The physical erasure accelerated. Akhenaten's monuments, already targeted under Tutankhamun, were now systematically dismantled. The Talatat blocks from the Aten temples at Karnak, those small, fast construction stones that had gone up in such a hurry, were pulled down and used as fill material inside new pylons. Tens of thousands of them, many still bearing painted scenes of the king and his family worshipping the Aten, were buried inside the walls of structures dedicated to the gods Akhenaten had tried to destroy. His statues were smashed, his inscriptions were gouged. His name, wherever it appeared, was chiseled from the stone with the same methodical thoroughness he had once applied to Amun's name, and Amarna itself was abandoned. The city that had risen from empty desert in a few years was left to the sand. The palaces stood empty. The painted floors cracked and faded. The workshops went silent. The diplomatic archive, those hundreds of clay tablets from foreign kings, the record of an empire's correspondence, lay in the ruins of the records office where they had been filed, undisturbed for over 3,000 years, until Flinders Petrie and his predecessors began pulling them from the dirt in the late 19th century. The royal tomb in the eastern cliffs was vandalized. The images of Akhenaten were attacked, his face destroyed, his cartouches gouged, the mourning scene over Mekhetaten's body left damaged but still legible, as if even the destroyers hesitated before erasing a father's grief. Or maybe they didn't hesitate. Maybe they were just thorough everywhere else and ran out of daylight here. I don't know. The evidence doesn't carry emotional intention, no matter how much we want it to. Later generations completed the forgetting. Ramses II, who came to power roughly 40 years after Akhenaten's death, built extensively at Karnak and across Egypt, and his constructions incorporated Amarna-era blocks as foundation fill without comment. The name Akhenaten does not appear in Ramesside records. The city of Amarna is not mentioned. The Aten theology is not refuted because refutation would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was precisely what the erasure was designed to prevent. By the logic of Egyptian belief, a name unspoken was a person unmade, not punished, not exiled, but dissolved, deprived of the identity that, in their understanding, sustained existence beyond death. The Pharaoh who had tried to reshape the relationship between humanity and the divine was sentenced to the one fate his civilization considered worse than death. He was sentenced to not having been, and it worked. For 3,000 years, it worked. The classical historians who visited Egypt, Herodotus, Diodorus, Manetho, knew nothing of Akhenaten. The king lists they consulted had been cleansed. The monuments they examined bore no trace. The priests they spoke with had no memory, or no memory they were willing to share. Akhenaten was gone so completely that when European archaeologists began excavating Amarna in the mid-19th century, they had no idea whose city they had found. The fragments came together slowly, the Talatat blocks recovered from Karnak's pylons, the boundary stelae deciphered on the cliffs, the royal tomb mapped and photographed, the Amarna letters translated from Akkadian, and piece by piece, over decades, a pharaoh reassembled himself from the rubble of his own destruction. The hatred that erased him is what preserved him. The blocks buried inside the pylons were protected from weathering. The city abandoned in the desert, never rebuilt upon, retained its ground plan more completely than almost any other Egyptian settlement. The tomb, vandalized but not sealed, kept its images. The campaign of destruction was so thorough, so systematic, so total in its ambition, that it created, inadvertently, an archaeological time capsule, a civilization's attempt to unmake a man, frozen at the moment of unmaking, legible to anyone willing to read the damage. The chisel marks at Karnak are still there, the same ones the camera showed in the first seconds of this story. The gouged cartouche, the smashed face, the wall that someone stood before, 3,000 years ago with a tool and an instruction: remove him. And they did. They removed him from the stone, from the record, from the king lists, from the prayers, from every surface that might carry his name forward into the future. Their belief system promised the righteous dead. They could not remove him from the ground. The desert kept what the system tried to erase. The fill inside the pylons kept what the builders tried to bury. And the silence, the vast, coordinated 3,000-year silence that was supposed to be his annihilation, became, in the end, the loudest thing about him. Because when you erase someone that completely, you leave the shape of the erasure, and the shape is a portrait. Negative space in the stone, holding the outline of a face that an entire civilization agreed should never be seen again. It is still being seen. If this changed how you see Egypt, even slightly, that's why I make these.